Hey everybody, this is chapter 10 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. Chapter 10 is titled Dinner at the White House. In the spring of 1941, Horkheimer and his wife moved to California, where they settled in Pacific Palisades, a western district of Los Angeles. Horkheimer was finally going to work on the long-planned book on dialectics. Dialectic of Enlightenment later evolved from this endeavor. The history of Pacific Palisades is externally linked to that of the California film industry, and that featured so prominently in Horkheimer and Adorno's. That featured. Jesus Christ. The history of Pacific Palisades is inextricably linked to that of the Californian film industry that featured so prominently in Horkheimer and Adorno's, quote, philosophical fragments, end quote. Beginning life as the Incivil Film Studio, where Western movies were filmed until 1922, Pacific Palisades grew rapidly into a district in its own right. As early as 1926, 250 families already lived there. Given its ideal location between Santa Monica, Malibu, and Brentwood, and its relatively temperate climate, it soon acquired the reputation of being the, quote, Californian Riviera, end quote. In the 1930s, it emerged as one of the most significant sites where German, and especially German Jewish emigre intellectuals settled. Quote, along with the adjacent neighborhoods of Brentwood, where Arnold Schoenberg, Theodore W. Adorno, and Fritz Kortner found refuge, and Santa Monica, where Fritz Lang, Bertolt Brecht, and Heinrich Mann found a home. Pacific Palisades was seen as a, quote, new Weimar on the Pacific, end quote, as, quote, Weimar under palms, end quote, both in the sense that significant minds congregated between the mountains and the Bay of Santa Monica in a small area comparable to the Weimar of Goethe's time, and in the sense that among the emigres who gathered here were some of the most prominent exponents of the Weimar Republic, the democratic Germany the Nazis had so brutally crushed when they took power in 1932, end quote. That the emigres lived cheek by jowl in Pacific Palisades dawned on Horkheimer as soon as he bought his property on d'Est Drive. Determined to get the estate general to agree to half the asking price, Horkheimer was amazed when the agent instantly consented and asked why. Quote, I had two properties, end quote. The agent responded, quote, and I have sold the first for a very good price, so I thought, let this man have the other, end quote. When Horkheimer inquired who his solvent new neighbor was, quote, it turned out that it was Thomas Mann. So we came to live close to each other and often went for walks together, where I learned many instructive and beautiful things. He told me a lot about his work and frequently read to me. I can only say we may not always have seen eye to eye, but we got on wonderfully. End quote. Of course, this kind of harmony was not universal. The opening scene of Joseph von Bacchi's Der Ruf, parenthesis, The Last Illusion, 1949, and parenthesis, based on a script by, parenthesis, and starring, in parenthesis, Horkheimer's California neighbor, Fritz Kortner, impressively highlighted the conflicts within this close-knit emigre community, whose members differed considerably in character, politics, and cultural orientation. It was the very specific constraints of exile that placed a conservative such as Thomas Mann at a soiree also attended by prominent communists such as Hans Eisler and Bertolt Brecht. I believe Hans Eisler would later write or compose the national anthem of East Germany, but I'm not sure. Marcuse and Adorno soon followed him to the West Coast. Pollock and Löwenthal meanwhile stayed in New York, where Pollock's workload only increased. On the Institute's stationery, Pollock's status now changed from assistant director to acting director. Horkheimer had chosen not him but Adorno as the co-author of his long-planned magnum opus. Nothing suggests that Pollock was jealous of Adorno. He felt that Löwenthal was underhanded and increasingly disliked him, radically disagreed with Neumann on crucial political issues, and fell out with Grossmann. Yet he held Adorno in enormous esteem. Pollock later recalled that Horkheimer and Adorno enjoyed a strong mutual resonance unavailable to him, quote, because Adorno is much more intelligent than me. I am intelligent enough to be fully aware of this. This has nothing to do with some kind of inferiority complex. It is simply a fact. I would not want to swap with him, nor would Horkheimer want him in my role, but this does not change the fact that he is extraordinarily smart and owns an extraordinarily productive receptive capacity, i.e. he is able, when Horkheimer hints at an idea, to draw it out, and I mean on the spot. This is a skill I do not possess. I frequently find it difficult to follow Horkheimer's line of thought. I'm often resistant, and it can take a while until I can convince myself that there is something in it after all. End quote. Theodor and Gretel Adorno settled just a few minutes by car from Max and Madame Horkheimer, and Adorno now grew into an established role alongside Horkheimer. As a result, he also grew closer and became increasingly friendly with Pollock. Even so, while there was always a room reserved for Fritz, now Fred, in Horkheimer's house, the same did not hold true for Teddy. For all their mutual emotional attachment, Adorno and Horkheimer were primarily congenial interlocutors and colleagues. And Pollock maintained his role as best friend and life partner. The account of his daily routine Horkheimer gave in a letter he wrote to Paul Tillich in the summer of 1942 reflects this, quote, in the morning, Pollock and I go for a short walk, then I study intensely before writing notes and drafts. In the afternoon, I usually see Teddy to work on the final text. Occasionally, I also meet Marcuse to discuss his sections. The evening belongs to Pollock and sometimes to Weil. Although Pollock came to California every couple of months, Pollock found the separation hard to bear and sought to distract himself by picking up with old acquaintances. Pollock occasionally met with Lily and Siegfried Krakauer, for example, who now lived in Manhattan too. He regularly spent time with Adolf Loewe and Paul Tillich, not only at their fortnightly circle. They went on short excursions to the countryside, where Pollock occasionally rented a horse. Pollock had learned to ride as a soldier, and aside from his walks with Horkheimer, horse riding seems to have been the only physical exercise he undertook to compensate for the strain of his endless office hours. The friendship between Pollock and Loewe, which, as we saw, harked back to their youth, intensified in the 1940s. They met frequently in New York and occasionally went on holiday together. On one of their trips staying at Bar Harbor, Maine, in July 1943, Pollock drew an affectionate, humorous, and penetrating sketch of Loewe. Pollock's caption read, quote, Colonel Loewe in mufti, end quote, parenthesis, i.e. in civilian clothing, and parenthesis, and poked fun at Loewe, who had recently met a delegation of high-ranking militaries at the White House. The drawing bears witness to Pollock's skills as an attentive and acute observer. 2 years after his wife's death, Pollock began to embark on occasional romantic adventures again. These included an unfortunate affair with Felix Weil's third wife, Lucille Weil, née Jakobowitz. She too originally came from Stuttgart. In 1936, she fled to New York, where she was barely able to make ends meet as a shop assistant and hat model. Horkheimer, who knew her from back home, recommended her as a private secretary to Weil, who promptly fell in love with and in 1939 married her. More interested in fast cars and fashion than books, she had a hard time fitting in with his intellectual friends and associates. So great was her interest in cars that she even took driving lessons, which is still quite unusual for women at this time. 2 years into the marriage, their relationship was on the rocks, principally because Felix Weil had already fallen in love with yet another infinitely more urbane woman, Helen Knoping. Not even divorced from Lucille, he was already planning his next wedding. Horkheimer and Pollock were not impressed. They liked Lucille, with whom Madame Horkheimer in particular had become friendly, and they were pretty fed up with Weil's womanizing. They were also concerned that Weil's chaotic private life was getting in the way of his work for the Institute and would prevent him from submitting his contribution to the dialectics book. Weil trusted his friend's advice not only in financial matters, but also in affairs of the heart, and Horkheimer decided that Pollock should mediate and try to save the Weil's marriage. Pollock and the Weils thereupon went on a short trip to the Catskills in upstate New York. Yet, instead of effecting a reconciliation, Pollock himself now fell in love with Weil's delightful third wife. While Felix Weil was busy studying, Pollock and Lucille went on long walks or rambling in the forest. His advances flattered her, and she soon began to flirt back. They continued to see each other after their return from the Catskills, and Pollock, quote, began to take her out, introduce her to theaters and museums, sought to make a woman of the world out of her. They embarked on an affair, or to be more precise, an amour fou, end quote. When Weil found out, far from reprimanding his friend, he reached an understanding with Pollock. Horkheimer was aghast. Quote, the idea of Fritz and Lucille entering into a relationship to bring her back to you was disgraceful from the outset. Once Fritz and you had jointly been this foolish, further misguided suggestions hardly came as a surprise. The newest misguided suggestion in the question was Pollock's plan to marry Lucille. Pollock rented a small studio apartment for Lucille and suggested that they would move to a larger residence following their marriage. Yet in the end, they did not marry, perhaps because Horkheimer, who felt that, quote, Fritz should not fall in love with the wife of his friend, let alone with Lucille, end quote, vetoed the plan, perhaps because Pollock himself had second thoughts. Lucille felt betrayed and subsequently characterized Pollock as a, quote, terrible liar and coward, end quote. Pollock lived in Morningside Heights on the Upper West Side, in the immediate vicinity of Columbia University. In 1944, the Institute rented an apartment in the same building at 90 Morningside Drive as its new office, entangling Pollock's life even more intimately with the work of the Institute. Pollock gave papers, attended meetings, was responsible for the Institute's correspondence, and read reports and proofs, took care of the books, and sought as best he could to keep the show on the road. Pollock's conviction was waning. However, for many years the journal was crucial to the Institute's work, holding its members and associates together, their political differences and geographical dispersal notwithstanding. Its termination was a grave blow, and Pollock, Löwenthal, and Horkheimer discussed the possibility of closing the Institute altogether, but having given the matter careful consideration, decided that the risks involved in doing so were too great. Colleagues who taught elsewhere often depended on their formal affiliation with Columbia. More importantly, without this affiliation, it would doubtless have been more difficult to secure the external resource funding on which the Institute depended more than ever. There was no ignoring the Institute's disintegration, however. Franz Neumann and Otto Kirchheimer had moved to Washington to work for the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the U.S. military's Foreign Intelligence Service, where Herbert Marcuse, after an initial 6-month stint at the Office of War Information, joined them in the spring of 1943. Involved in what was effectively a form of enemy reconnaissance, they now made a practical contribution to the war effort against Nazi Germany. This is a matter of considerable pride and prestige and close to Pollock's heart, too. As we saw, he had advised the National Planning Board long before any of his colleagues would likely have condoned working for the military intelligence service of a capitalist state. Yet now, his naturalization in 1940 notwithstanding, his advances were rejected by the intelligence services because he was still on an FBI watch list. In June 1943, confronted with rumors that the FBI was going after the Institute's members and intended to ensure Neumann and Marcuse were sacked, Pollock turned to the former senator for Utah, William H. King, whom he had met at a reception. Writing to Horkheimer on the day, Pollock described King as, quote, remarkably young for a man of 80, conservative, a vehement proponent of state law versus central control, a critic of the New Deal, and mates with everyone including Edgar Hoover, end quote. The following day, Pollock was able to report that neither the Institute nor any of its members were being investigated, and there was no cause for concern. King had spoken not to Hoover, but to the renowned legal scholar Edward Levi, who served as a special assistant to the U.S. Attorney General during the war, and who later, as Attorney General under Ford, severely curtailed the powers of the Bureau. End parenthesis. The ensuing political intervention apparently also led to Pollock's file being expunged. A few weeks later, he received an official invitation to serve as an advisor to the economic section of the OSS. Among the forms Pollock was now required to complete was an application for security clearances for, quote, highly confidential assignments, end quote. While Pollock did receive an employment contract after some months, unlike Neumann, he was initially refused any kind of security clearance. Either Pollock himself or somebody else at the OSS would not let the matter rest, however. The relevant file includes a handwritten note of April 1944 stating that it had been, quote, decided just to, quote, sit, end quote, on the case for a month or two longer, with the thought that it would die a natural death. It evidently did not, and on the 3rd of June, the Security Office informed the Civilian Personnel Office that, quote, as a result of further investigation and consideration, we are hereby withdrawing our recommendation for a security disapproval issued on the 14th of March, 1944, and substituting an approval which has been limited by the Secretariat to the following conditions, which it will be the responsibility of the branch head to enforce in the event subject is employed. 1. He should not have access to any, quote, top secret, end quote, material. 2. He should not have access to, quote, confidential or, quote, secret, end quote, material relating to the operational, as distinguished from the intelligence functions of the OSS. The methods we use in collecting intelligence would be regarded as operational. 3. Before employment, the branch head should consult this office in order to be thoroughly familiar with the subject's history and background so that subject can be governed accordingly in his future relations with subject. Before employment, the branch head should consult this office in order to be thoroughly familiar with subject's history and background so that the branch head can be governed accordingly in the branch head's future relations with subject. End quote. These very substantial limitations notwithstanding, Pollock was nevertheless exceedingly well informed. Pollock's relations to Neumann had markedly improved and even become friendly since his move to Washington, and Neumann kept him up to date. Even more importantly, Pollock had become politically extremely well connected. Pollock was one of the founders of the Research Bureau for Postwar Economies, an organization that submitted expert reports and proposals for postwar economic policies in the White House. To the White House. More significant yet were his appointments as advisor to the Board of Economic Warfare and the War Production Board created by Executive Order 1941/42. Pollock was only too pleased to be able to contribute to the increasingly promising war effort, at least in this way. The dinner invitation Pollock received from Eleanor Roosevelt in February 1943 in many ways marked the culmination of his political engagement. As First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt was not only the wife of the president, but a usually popular figure in her own right. If in different ways, Eleanor Roosevelt was just as active politically as her husband. Eleanor Roosevelt gave interviews and held press conferences on political topics, and in her national syndicated column, quote, My Day, end quote, which she began to publish in 1936, reported on her meetings with a broad range of social groups, representative bodies, and charitable associations. All this is highly unusual for a First Lady and earned her a good deal of criticism, too. Yet most U.S. citizens viewed her as a collective mother figure and greatly revered her. Pollock was, of course, one of hundreds who received such dinner invitations from Eleanor Roosevelt, yet for Pollock it was an extraordinary honor. Together with Adolf Loewe, Pollock had met with the First Lady in late January 1943 and evidently impressed her. In a confidential letter to Horkheimer, quote, not for the files, end quote, end parenthesis, Pollock reported that he had stolen Loewe's thunder. The meeting lasted until midnight, and Roosevelt was so impressed that she invited Pollock and his associates to meet her husband and present their proposals for the post-war order to him personally. Pollock suggested it would make more sense for him to meet with Vice President Henry A. Wallace first to prepare the meeting with FDR, and the First Lady agreed. Horkheimer, who shared in the honor of the invitation vicariously, congratulated Pollock in English. Quote, I wish to tell you that the invitation by which you have been honored was a real satisfaction for Maidan and for myself. You know, I don't overestimate successes, particularly when there is only a very slight chance that they may have any tangible consequences. But in this case, I seriously think that we ought to be very grateful. It was a great experience, and whatever will come out or not come out of it, you have the right to be proud of it. I told you more than once how much I would give if I were offered the opportunity to listen in on conversations of historical importance. By the fact of your invitation, a little bit of the wish has come true." End quote. Pollock's subsequent assessment was more restrained. Quote, "I wrote you a postcard telling you that the dinner was, quote, great fun," end quote. This is true, in a way. On the other hand, I was seldom so depressed as when I left the beautiful house my hosts are living in. Depressed because the whole situation is so desperate, and the people who are supposed to cope with it are so utterly inadequate, ... When I left the house, I had a sensation of being completely emptied, not because the invitation was not a, quote, success, end quote, but to the contrary, it came out better than could reasonably be expected, but because everything appeared so futile, so utterly inadequate. On the one side lies the future of humanity, on the other all the forces of evil forming a more and more streamlined coalition, ... and between both these well-meaning but basically helpless people." End quote. Pollock. A further meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt took place in June 1943, this time over lunch at the Roosevelt's New York home at 29 Washington Square. Pollock, Tillich, Luva, Hans Staudinger, and a colleague from the Self-Help Committee spent some 3 hours with the First Lady, explaining their position on post-war Reconstruction. Quote, "As desert strawberries from Mr. Morgenthau's farm were served," end quote, or Morgenthau's farm were served, end quote, Pollock noted after the lunch, quote, "They were outstanding, so was the hostess," end quote. He recorded the outcome of the gathering as follows, quote, "Miss R. urgently asked, quote, the group," end quote, "to do the following. 1. Write a program for European Reconstruction. 2. Write in so simple and two-syllable words and brief sentences that even a congressman will be able to understand it. 3. Appeal to the self-interest of the average man. Explain how the peace will affect him. Show that a humanitarian and just peace is, quote, good business," end quote, under 2 points of view. It will help to overcome depression here in USA and save our children from World War III. 4. Explain that a not-so-harsh treatment is not motivated by, quote, Gefühlsduselei, end quote, bracket sloppiness, bracket soppiness, end bracket, which would be unjustifiable after what the Germans have done, but by cold reasoning, how to avoid the next World War. It is most necessary to get a reasonable assurance of, quote, peace in our time, end quote, even if the Germans should get a better treatment than they deserve. 5. Show the alternatives, etc. most clearly and illustrate them from past experience. The memory of the public is very short. Such a manuscript would be discussed first between the President and Mr. Wallace, and later, as she hopes, between both of them and the, quote, the group, end quote. The language should be simple because the President too wants to grasp quickly and without researching what is meant, ... More complicated theoretical explanations should be postponed until the discussion has started, end quote. This was how politics worked. Eleanor was an excellent teacher when it came to the art of diplomacy. If one wanted to secure political agreement, one needed to make one's cause attractive to those on whose support one depended. Moral objections and appeals to universal values achieved little in this sphere. While it is unclear that what Pollock and his colleagues ultimately submitted, a, quote, tentative worksheet for a discussion on European, foremost German, Reconstruction, end quote, of the 11th of January 1943 gives us an indication of Pollock's thinking on the matter. Pollock identified 6 conceivable post-war regimes. Quote, A. Autonomous revolution. B. Revolution under Russian control. C. Catholic fascist solution. D. Constitutional monarchies. E. Reactionary American occupation and reactionary coalition government. F. Enlightened American occupation and welfare collectivism, end quote. Pollock explicitly stated that the options A and B did not merit consideration. He pointed to Metternich's increasingly crisis-prone system as evidence for the fact that option C would offer, quote, a temporary peace only, end quote. Given that the document was only an outline, it did not explain why option D was no solution either, but obviously made precious little sense in the German case. This left only two options: reactionary or enlightened occupation. The paper suggested that the former would succeed only in the short term. The paper expressly referred to the Austrian-American Social Democrat Egon Wertheimer, who held an adjunct position in international affairs at the American University and advised the State Department. He had recently published a widely discussed book with the title "Victory is Not Enough: A Strategy for Lasting Peace." In it, Wertheimer made the case for a, quote, realistic, end quote, foreign policy based on the insight that only the victorious powers enduring threat of force will be able to ensure that peace prevailed in the long run. Enlightenment and rational insight were attractive goods, but the League of Nations had demonstrated that they could not be relied upon. Wertheimer thus presented the preliminary outline of what could become the policy of deterrence that took center stage during the Cold War. To Pollock's mind, this approach fell short because it offered no perspective for the democratization of society in the vanquished European nations that was the centerpiece of the benevolent and, quote, enlightened, end quote, occupation the Institute envisaged. Once Nazism was defeated, there would be no groups in Germany capable of initiating and driving the democratization process, hence such forces would need to be carefully created and fostered. The United States would need to oversee the development of trade unions, educational institutions, and decentralized local administrations. The Institute envisaged a fundamental restructuring of the German state and a comprehensive program of public enlightenment. Just the kind of reconstruction and re-education policy the United States initially did pursue in Germany until Wertheimer's realism won the day and the goal of substantive denazification was radically pared down to placate the Germans. In early 1944, Pollock was back at the White House to discuss the drafted program. This time FDR was in attendance again. Friedrich Pollock, the leftist social critic and former Marxist who hid communists involved in the Bavarian Soviet Republic in his flat in Munich, who attended the celebrations marking the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution in Moscow, was an official guest and who collaborated with the Soviet Marx Engels, who attended the celebrations marking the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution in Moscow as an official guest, and who collaborated with the Soviet Marx Engels Institute for several years, several of whose colleagues were Soviet spies, and who until recently was himself on the radar of the FBI, was now engaged in face-to-face discussions with the President of the United States, a constellation surely owed to the very specific circumstances of the Second World War. Pollock's friends and acquaintances could hardly fail to notice all this, and he was the subject of much gossip, especially among the German emigre community in Los Angeles, many of whose members regularly gathered in Brecht's house for tea or at the Feuchtwanger's cocktail parties. When Pollock began to sermonize about the state of the world at one of these gatherings, the listeners quickly split into friend and foe. A diary entry by Horkheimer's neighbor Thomas Mann from October 1945 may convey a sense of the course of such gatherings. Quote, dinner party to mark, bracket, Alfred, and bracket, Neumann's 50th birthday with Peter Pringsheim, Leon Frank, Miss Horkheimer, Dr. Pollock, champagne and lobster, filet, fruit flan. Conversations about matters nuclear, America and Russia, the state of capitalism, Europe's path to socialism. As for America, the question whether in the case of a downturn after the boom of the next 3 to 5 years, civil war or an external war loom, evidently no suggestion of an immediate preemptive war against Russia. End quote. Pollock loved such occasions. Pollock disliked public appearances and only reluctantly gave public lectures, but he thrived in closed groups, be they committees or cocktail parties. Some greatly respected and admired Pollock, others intensely detested him for his conduct on such occasions. The composer Hans Eisler, for example, who had been friendly with Adorno since they were young men, could not stand Pollock, and suggested to Brecht that Pollock and his associates would provide a wonderful foil for the material Brecht had collected for his planned Twee Novel. This certainly appealed to Brecht, who had nothing but contempt for the Institute. In August 1941, he wrote in his journal, quote, "At a garden party, ... I met the twin clowns Horkheimer and Pollock, two twees from the Frankfurt Sociological Institute. Horkheimer is a millionaire, Pollock merely from a well-off background, which means Horkheimer can buy himself a university chair, quote, as a front for the Institute's revolutionary activities," end quote, wherever he happens to be staying, end quote. Writing to Karl Korsch to the ends of 1941, he explained that he now met Horkheimer and Pollock only at parties and social gatherings, and, quote, the Twee Novel aside, end quote, had little use for them. Brecht created the acronym Twee by dissecting and reassembling the word intellectual as ʻpɛlɛk, in. For Brecht, intellectuals had sold out. They were pitiful opportunists who in their utter helplessness sought favor with the powers that be, and the, quote, Frankfurtists, end quote, were the worst of Twees. In material from the 1930s and 1940s, and especially in his play, Turandot oder der Kongress der Weißwäscher, or Turandot, or the Whitewashers Congress of 1953, they were, as Hans Mayer too is confirmed, the barely disguised butts of his mockery. In the play, a version of Pollock featured as the economics Twee who asks, quote, "Ladies, how can we make a success of business?" end quote, and answers, quote, "Take a look in my book, and for just a yen, you too can find out what the science of economics has to say about it." Imagine business isn't going well. The big fish keep me wriggling in the dark. Why then I scratch my last remaining hairs out and ask how I can get to be a shark. I know what folk endure to earn their bread, and for their pains they get it up the butt. They're good for nothing, or they're good for fleecing. I know the score, and so I take my cut, end quote. Like Medicine Twee and Love Life Twee, the economics Twee is ridiculous rather than menacing. The portrayal of Munkadoo, a great Twee, was less charitable yet. At the Twee Congress, he gives a speech emphatically extolling the value of freedom that is quite intentionally devised to draw attention away from the actual relations of power and domination. He is evidently decapitated and his head is mounted on a spike. Both the German and British editors of the play concur that Munkadoo bears, quote, caricatural traits of Theodor Adorno, end quote. Not least given that the Institute was still supporting him financially, Korsch was rather more well-disposed towards Pollock and his colleagues. Pollock later recalled that in the United States, Korsch was allowed nowhere near the Institute, quote, because we knew that Korsch is a troublemaker who ends up quarreling with everyone, bracket, and who, end bracket, was awfully loquacious. If one asked him a question, he would go on forever. On the other hand, we respected him as a man of integrity and someone who knew his stuff when it came to Marxism, theoretical and practical Marxism, end quote. From a letter he wrote to the council communist Paul Maddock back in 1938, we know that Korsch, conversely, greatly valued Pollock, both as a scholar and a human being. By contrast, he was unimpressed by Löwenthal's and Neumann's intellectual abilities, though he appreciated their personal integrity as authors. In terms of their convictions, all the members of the Institute were, quote, without exception to varying degrees anti-Stalinist, end quote, but in the current situation, parenthesis, 1938, end parenthesis, they shied away both from directly confronting party communism and from nailing their flag to what for Korsch was the only true and valid form of Marxism. Pollock continued to feel some sympathy for the anti-Stalinist, yet still revolutionary Marxist Korsch in the 1940s, but theoretically they had grown far apart. Pollock was now rarely concerned with Marx and tended to be preoccupied with American industrial sociology and standard economic research literature, the sort of literature Korsch, Maddock, and Brecht contemptuously dismissed as, quote, vulgar economics, end quote. All of them were intrigued by Aldous Huxley's dystopian bestseller, Brave New World of 1932, which continued to be an important point of reference for Pollock for the remainder of his life. In the summer of 1942, Pollock participated for several weeks in an informal seminar on the theory of needs with Brecht, Eisler, Ludwig Marcuse, Gunther Anders, and several other institute members that focused on Brave New World and addressed the possibility that, quote, that capitalism might be capable of meeting all basic needs, end quote. In line with his concept of state capitalism, Pollock assumed this was so and asked whether one could still speak of domination. Should he be right? Quote, if capitalism can abolish need, what then distinguishes socialism from capitalism? End quote, he asked provocatively. What was emerging here were the outlines of the concept of the administered world, of which Adorno in particular became a prominent proponent after the war. Would not a system capable of accommodating all material needs and interests curtail freedom? Do creativity, individuality, autonomy, and the arts not depend on the tension that arises when needs are not only or only partially met? Quote, will human beings still pursue higher goods if they are full? What is there once the hunger is satisfied? End quote. The Brecht faction was outraged and maintained that one could only really begin to think once one was no longer hungry. In the end, the participants could only agree to disagree. Back in New York, Pollock met with Löwe and Tillich in May 1943 for a historiosophical symposium that reflects Pollock's stance more clearly, given its far less polemical character. The point of departure for their discussion was the question of whether the course of history was in some way predetermined and to what extent the decisions of individuals influenced its unfolding. For Pollock, the former assumption was simply theological. It was surely not preordained that history would descend into barbarism as it now had. What then were the decisive forces that channeled historical contingency in one direction or another? The second part of the question was even more specific. Who was responsible for the barbarism? Did it spring from individual criminal acts or as more universal malignancy? Did it make sense to identify individual culprits when dealing with historical events? Quote, how significant are individuals' how significant are individuals' actions? Quote, how significant are individuals' actions? End quote. Löwe asked. Quote, how would history have unfolded if Hitler had not attacked? What would have happened to England if the Blitzkrieg had been resumed a few months later with a better equipped Luftwaffe? End quote. Responding to these counterfactual scenarios, Pollock doubted that, quote, much would have changed in all these cases. Napoleon would have been able to ship landing troops across, but unable to defend their supply lines against the British Navy. Kerensky's government would have been toppled by radical forces sooner or later. Even if Hitler had continued his assault on England and postponed the invasion of the Soviet Union, he would probably have still lost the war. End quote. Much depended, quote, on the status of the subject responsible for fatal decisions. For an individual, a single mistake may indeed prove fatal and entirely alter the direction of his life. When it comes to a large country like Germany, this is much less likely, and it certainly does not hold true for the history of Europe or the globe. End quote. Pollock was still convinced that material relations determine the course of history, but, unlike conventional Marxists, Pollock assumed that its course was subject to some measure of contingency, given that it had no inherent telos. This explained why the world had been able to descend into barbarism, but also made it impossible to foresee what might transpire once humankind's basic needs were universally met and no one needed to fear for their existence anymore. This brought him back to Huxley's account of what he interpreted as state capitalism. On this occasion, his assessment was much more optimistic than it had been in the Californian debate. Quote, until now, human beings have never been given the opportunity to develop fully. One second. Fuck, man. Fuck me. Fuck. That's gnarly. Sorry, I even forgot. I thought I was recording. There's a lot of rain came through the window. Christ on the cross. Okay. I think that's about as settled as I can get it. Sorry about that. I'm sure this is annoying to listen to, but you're going to have to forgive me. Because what choice do you have? Okay. Just started storming rather suddenly. All right. Quote, until now, human beings have never been given the opportunity to develop fully. One knows from the world of technology that the more conducive the surroundings and the easier life is, the more human qualities in the narrower sense develop, end quote. Given that, quote, the social climate of the class society basically destroys everything that is deserving and capable of affection, end quote, human beings had as yet never really, quote, stood a chance, end quote. And as Louva noted at a gathering in January 1945, these discussions rarely led to any kind of satisfactory conclusion. Quote, our situation resembles that of the old Jewish tale of the two quarreling parties before the rabbi. The first party makes its case and the rabbi says, you are right. The opponent makes his case and the rabbi says, you are right. Thereupon a third party takes issue with this contradiction and the rabbi says, you too are right. End quote. Even so, for Pollock, whose administrative burden constantly threatened to bury alive, these debates were an essential. Even so, for Pollock, whom his administrative burden constantly threatened to bury alive, these debates were an essential lifeline. When such opportunities arose, Pollock would speak not only about economics, but also about theology, the relationship between theory and praxis, or the new woman. As we saw, Pollock and Horkheimer were great Ibsen enthusiasts in their youth. Given that his work radically questioned established gender roles, they enjoyed a broad reception among first-wave feminists. While his own treatment of women was profoundly patronizing in practice, it went without saying that as a progressive thinker he was a staunch feminist in theory. What Pollock had to say on the matter certainly impressed Hannah Tillich, who, at some point in 1943, wrote to him to let him know, quote, just how much your seminar paper and your conversation in the car, parenthesis, this I'm sure you will have forgotten, in parenthesis, helped me, and how wonderful and comforting it is to me that individuals of your kind and personality are working on the problems of our tumultuous age. ... After the seminar, I said to Paulus, you can prepare a sculpture of Fred Pollock for Riverside Church, parenthesis, next to Einstein, end parenthesis. He is the only theologian among you who has the courage to take a fresh psychological and moral look at human beings from the vantage point of economic necessities and in terms of the ways in which they are shaped by these necessities, ... Time and again, then, when it came to my difficulties with Paulus, I have said, ... we are not wrong at all, ... It is just marriage with its economic dependencies and absurd and confused assumptions that is lethal or at least threatens to suffocate us, end quote. Not that Pollock was always a successor when called upon in a pastoral capacity. Pollock was frequently too sober in his response to display genuine empathy with his interlocutors. In his ultimately neither completely nor published memoirs, Felix Vahl referred to, quote, Pollock's friendly smile, end quote, but then suggested that it was to some degree deceitful. Quote, for Pollock, end quote, Weil wrote, quote, I was a rich boy whom one would be able to teach a lot if one snuck the right note, or to be more precise, the right note, if one struck the right note, or to be more precise, the right notes. The ones that resonated with me were scientific Marxism and friendship, end quote. As we saw, Weil's memoirs, written in the early 1970s, need to be taken with a considerable pinch of salt. Leaving the numerous factual errors to one side, Weil's account of his dealings with the Institute was permeated by a profound sense of betrayal. He was no longer involved with the Institute as establishment he had initiated, and his politics were now far removed from those of his late friends. For him, their shift from Marxism to critical theory was simply a matter of treachery. Above all, Weil felt that he and his contributors had not received the credit they were owed, and he therefore set about making Horkheimer and Pollock look bad. Even so, Weil's claim that Pollock could seem two-faced cannot simply be dismissed out of hand. His honesty and sincerity are not in doubt, but it is clear that neither did he always tell the whole truth. The only person with whom he dared speak openly about everything, something he had not been able to do even with his wife, continued to be Horkheimer. Yet here he was, separated from Max and Medan, far removed from the Ile Heureuse. It was high time to leave New York and move to the West Coast. Okay, that's the end of chapter 10. I apologize again for that interruption. Thank you so much for listening.